everyone, and welcome to the latest Scots Whay Hae podcast. And this podcast is all about new dance theatre. Later, I'll be talking to Louise Ahl about her new experimental solo opera work, Skunk Without K is Son, which is on at the Take Me Somewhere festival. But first, I'll be talking to choreographer Elisabeth Schilling about her groundbreaking dance concert performance, Here Eyes Move, Dances with Ligeti. I hope you enjoy. And I'm joined now by dance choreographer Elisabeth Schilling to hear about Here Eyes Move, Dances with Ligeti. Hello, Elisabeth.
Hi, Alistair. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. So how would you describe to our listeners Here Eyes Move, Dances with Ligeti?
So Here Eyes Move is a dance concert or a concert dance where we choreographically interpret all the 18 etudes for piano written by Hungarian composer György Ligeti. And György Ligeti is a Hungarian composer, and a lot of choreographers have actually used his music or parts of the etudes, but no one has ever done all the 18, so quite proud of that and also excited to share with our audiences.
And is there something about his music that really lends itself to being interpreted in dance?
Well, I personally think so. I feel like, for example, when I listened to Ligeti for the very first time, it was in 2011, it was his first string quartet. I was really struck by the rhythmicality that Ligeti uses because he comes straight from this tradition of Stravinsky, Bartók. So he uses very polyrhythmic structures, which I feel very attractive to work with dance. But I also felt there were a lot of textures that he was using in his music. So I personally feel like his music gives a rich fit for dance, but it certainly also has its challenges because it's some of the most difficult music that exists out there in the world. So I feel it's not the easiest to dance to. Although I would say, and I think some musicologists agree with me, that his music is movement.
And could you tell us a bit about who György Ligeti was and his legacy that he's left?
Yeah, so it's a bit difficult to be short about this, who he was.
That's okay, we've got all the time.
So I would in my own words, I would say to me, he was really a genius in his field. He was born 1923 and was supposed to study, or he was really interested in physics, and he was supposed to study physics. However, he was also Jewish, so unfortunately he was not allowed to the university. So that's why he went then into composition. So he studied under Bartók, and so the early compositions, you really feel this Hungarian influence. And then after the Second World War, where he lost, I think, his mother and his brother, he lived a little bit in the communist times, and then he fled to Vienna and later on to Cologne. And I think that was a very these kind of political systems that he lived in, as well as the immigration, seem to have been very striking to his not only to his biography but also his music making, because throughout his lifetime he resisted any form of idealisms in political system, any forms of extremes, which we can also find in the way he wrote music. But also because I think he's very special in the way that he really has this craftsmanship from the classical tradition, from this Eastern European tradition as well. And he then in Cologne, he met composers like Stockhausen, he met the early developments of electronic musics. And whilst he experimented with those ideas, he never really stuck to them, but they influenced his music. So, for example, he did musical compositions in the 60s and 70s where he would take on ideas from electronic music making but transform them onto orchestras. So basically, to me, he was a composer who had a variety of influences, and if you would like to, I can speak more about this and how they influence our dance. And I feel like this is what makes him so incredibly rich. And I'm just personally so struck on how his mind works if you really go into the depth of his compositions, his compositional concept, of how he's able to connect the seemingly most widespread associations into super complex musical structures. I will stop here.
No, that's fascinating because it's not someone I know at all.
Yeah.
But from what you're saying, it's almost like straddling 20th century classical music from a
Yeah,
kind of older
yeah,
tradition to
yeah.
something which is quite modern.
Absolutely, like completely. I mean, yes, and the fascinating thing is that he was not only inspired by music, he was inspired, for example, he was so curious, and I find this so inspirational as an artist as well. For example, he in the 70s, I think early 1970s, there was a philosopher who's, I believe, Austrian English, maybe even, called Karl Popper. And he wrote an essay on clocks and clouds. So, for example, how I will say it in my own words briefly. If people would like to hear more about it, they can Google it. So how like cloud systems are supposedly predictable and you can calculate them. So like machine-like.
Right.
And how clouds in the other extremes are, you can't calculate them, they're unpredictable. So they are more like phenomena of chaos theory. And so, for example, he took those ideas and used them in his music making. Or he was also super inspired by Alice in Wonderland, or drawings by Maurits Escher, you know, which is seemingly super chaotic, but they do have a structure. So he put all of those ideas together, and like the more you dig into his compositional works and you really study them, the more you see where he took his inspiration from and how he transformed it. And I find that quite completely striking.
So he always kept that kind of scientific mind. He wanted to study physics, but
Yeah.
that inquiring scientific mind was always there.
Yeah, I believe so. And I mean, I believe music making is a very, I feel like it's a much more, depends on which music you make, but it's quite a mathematical process. So it's much more mathematical than some of the dancing we do, I would suppose. So he definitely had that mind. And he just had this mind also he was just curious, but he had this mind for complexity. And it was there, for example, like I really studied also his early works. He had different phases of his life. For example, his early works, as I said, was definitely influenced by Bartok or this tradition. And then he had those influences from Cologne and Germany, electronic music. But then throughout his lifetime, basically the influences became much more complex. There was there was a phase in his creative life where he would completely compose, I would say, like cloud compositions, where there was in the orchestra there was no hierarchy, so to say, and you would just hear like states. Like cloudy states, I would say. But then with the etudes, actually the etudes were written in the first book of the etudes was written in 1985, and they were written after a long creative break. And you can feel that because it's like the start of a new creative phase, I would say, because I feel like really with the etudes he brought so many things together that he was working on throughout his whole lifetime. And I feel also that's what makes the piano etudes so very special, because they are so rich.
So even though he was doing different styles and different influences, you can still know it's Ligeti. There's a line that runs through everything, yes?
Oh, completely. I would say absolutely. You cannot not hear that.
How does his music translate into dance for you and into the show?
So when I create choreography, or especially with Ligeti, because I have so much respect for his music, because it's so complex. Well, I have several like strands of how I could explain my approach to it. So when I heard his music for the first time in 2011, I was just like, as a dancer, very struck by the rhythmicality and the texture. So I started drawing his music. And so I came, and then from the drawings I tried to translate the drawings again into movement and try to find the textures or rhythmicality in the movement that I would find from the drawings. So this is a practice I kept going for the last 10 years. So that was one column of my research. And then the second one was that in 2020 we had COVID, so I had lots of time. The piece was also created in 2020. We were very lucky to have made it. But also it gave me the time to read a lot. And I've read 14 books about Ligeti and all his inspirations, which I felt like it was quite, I almost felt I had to do this just because his inspirations are so rich. And in order to understand his music from a scientific standpoint, I felt like I really had to understand where he was coming from. So I had this information, but then lastly, and that is something I don't want to forget to say, is also like what I call the choreographic ear, and that by that I mean the emotive, the intuitive listening to how the music speaks to you, because I hear a lot of colors, a lot of textures, and they were also part of the creative process. And so with the 18 etudes, I approached it really one by one, because every single one of those etudes has its very own compositional concept. And this is also so interesting about Ligeti, that he gave himself a lot of restriction in the creation, which probably makes it hard compositionally for him. But yeah, the end result is just very rich because it's so concise. So I would say, like, for every etude, I made a starting point based on the compositional concept of the music, but then also based on my own intuitive hearing. Like, for example, the first etude is called Désordre. Désordre means not ordered. So when you hear it for the first time, like when I heard it for the first time, I felt like, oh, it's throwing me out of the window. It's so powerful. So when I then studied it, it's actually a polyrhythm, which is décalé. I don't know what that is in English. It's like a phrasing going away from each other. And so then I had this idea of, with the dancers, of doing a polyrhythm to the polyrhythm. So you hear a melody, even though it's not written down. So we would create a rhythm to that melody that you would hear, which is not that rhythm of that melody. But at the same time, I had this image in my mind, almost as if it's trees in the wind, which whose leaves is like fluttering like this. So I had this, and I saw, like, when you hear it yourself, I mean, for me, it's definitely like dark red. There is like a sense of passion. There's a sense of acceleration, climax, ecstatic. It's ecstatic also. So all those feelings made its way, plus also the idea of machines and smoke, into the creation of the first etude. And so, for example, with the sixth etude, which is the closing of the first book, it was written as a lamenting canon of fugue.
Right.
And so our starting point was completely different, because basically the inspiration for Ligeti was a political event in 1985 in Poland, where a lot of people died. So it has a lot of drama. So that's why there's the lamentation. So how we started creating this was, I just gave the dancers a lot of images of lamenting sculptures. So, and I gave them the task to find lamenting gestures. So we started from there. But now it gets a bit complex. But then also, because I'm very interested in texture, so sometimes I would give them the task of, like, find some movements, make some movements based on wooden textures or linear textures or like water. So we had all those different textures, and so we made like rivers of those textures in a very intricate way in a canon form together, if that makes sense, because the way I hear this etude is lots of rivers flowing into each other. So you see, it's like, it's quite how the choreography developed is quite a complex way of accumulating his scientific ideas, his emotive ideas, and then mine. Yeah.
So it's like it's not just the music itself, but you're hearing other senses are being evoked.
Yeah, completely. And maybe what's also interesting to know is that Ligeti was a synesthesiast. So I believe we all are in some ways or another. So this is someone who, so for example, he would write text in German. He spoke a lot of languages, but as he lived in Germany, he would write text in German of how he heard other people's music or even his own. And the way he would write is, for example, I don't know anything by heart now, but I just give you an example, like, oh, this sounds like mud, a golden mud becoming the sunshine, or something like this. So quite surrealistic. And I felt I could completely relate to how he would describe certain musics. Yeah, and I just, because I draw music, I completely like, I realized that I also hear his music more like textures or colors, or like in that kind of way, which was really inspirational to my choreography. So that's something I learned of myself through him.
And it's this idea that he kind of restricted himself and gave himself boundaries. almost instinctively you think, well, that doesn't allow for passion. It doesn't, it keeps it in. But what you're saying is that absolutely you can have both. You can still have the passion that comes out of a kind of strict structure. Maybe you need that.
Yeah. Well, I feel for me this is Ligeti's genius, because I believe very good art, like that's my complete personal opinion, is highly conceptual but also highly emotive, and for me Ligeti is that, and also very accessible, because I mean I believe Ligeti is very accessible. For me it is emotive in a sense that you might not always be able to say, oh, this emotion is happiness, this etude is happiness, this etude is sadness. Like, for example, I did those kids workshops and some of the kids said, oh, it's a bit angry but also a bit happy, so it's like states in between, or states even before an emotion as such is formed, if you want to speak about the emotive component. So yeah, for me, yeah, it's very striking and very moving, this music.
And you mentioned dancers, plural. So how many people are on stage?
Yeah, we have 5 dancers on stage.
And has it, you've toured this already, it's been around Europe, is that right?
Yeah, so we had our like fake premiere in December 2020, where we had 10 people in the audience, basically only the directors of the theater, but then we were lucky to have been invited to premiere it again with an audience in July 2021 at the Grand Theatre in Luxembourg. And then we toured to our co-producing partners in Germany, to Mosel Musikfestival, Kunstfest Weimar. And now, because we're celebrating Ligeti's 100th birthday this year, we toured quite a bit through Germany, south of France. We were at the festival of in Avignon in Austria, and now we're in Scotland, which I'm so happy about.
I was interested in, does it change at all, or is it absolutely strict every night that this is how we do it? Is there any kind of improvisation or changes as you go, as you tour?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say it's very strict, because you have to know, dancing to Ligeti with live music is quite something, because for example, like this piano music is some of the most difficult piano repertoires that exists on this world, and for our pianist, he often says, like, oh, if I play one note wrong, I'm out of here, so I can't fake it, basically. And so our dancers feel that tension. There is that tension. And also, like, the way I created this choreography is that when you come to see it, you will see it. They're chained to each other energetically. No one is individual. Like, they're all in a net. One action has a consequence. So this comes all from this idea of chaos theory, I believe. Because we created it in COVID times. We created it in times where our climate is going downhill. Like the nature around us is dying. So I feel like this whole idea of that we are all interconnected, we all have a responsibility, just unconsciously, is very much, or was very much, and is still very much part of my practice, and very much part of my being, I believe. And so you really see this interconnectivity of the dancers on stage, and if one person does a mistake, they all have to find a solution for it in the most minuscule moment. And at the beginning of the piece, there was a huge respect of the dancers, and a respect, a fear maybe a little bit, to perform this piece, because it takes focus, it takes a lot of inner strength, and also a sense of togetherness with the music within the group of the dancers. Now I feel like we've done it so many times, like 20 times, so I feel like even though the casts change a bit, people feel more comfortable in it and get a little bit more full in it. So I would say that has changed. So within that super strict structure, there has developed a sense of playfulness. Yes.
It sounds like I understand that idea, certainly initially, that there's almost a tension to get it right when it's so exacting, and that's almost part of the performance.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like this performance lives off the tension.
Yeah,
but every good performance does, I feel.
Interesting. Because I've spoken to quite a few jazz musicians recently, and what they'll say is that almost it's different every night, because they are improvising.
Yeah.
That's almost part of it, to create something new, although it's still the same song or the same piece of music. Yeah. And you said there that you're in Scotland, and you're going to be touring in Scotland. Because am I right to say you lived here for a while?
Yes, I lived here for 1 year. I was a guest artist at Scottish Dance Theatre about 10 years ago.
So is this something I can see by your face? You're really looking forward to it. You should let people know where they can see it.
Yeah, so we're performing at the Bayer Theatre on the 17th of October, so very soon. And this is our UK premiere. And right after, on the 21st of October, we are at the Dance Live Festival at the Music Hall in Aberdeen.
Oh, fantastic. Excellent.
Yeah.
And aside from dance, what are the other theatrical aspects that people can expect?
So design plays an important role in the piece. I would say so. We work with a set designer who created a set which is also inspired by Ligeti, because Ligeti, you know, when you hear the music, it's quite extreme. He tries to almost goes all the time. Like there's one quote by, I think it was a critic. He said, "Oh, Ligeti always tries to go over the piano notes. You know, he always goes above the space and beyond the space of the piano." So we and this is so present in the music, those extremes. So we really try to create a set design that goes out into the space. And of course, also the costumes were created with the music in mind. We played with the idea of asymmetry, which is also which is present in the composition, but it's also present in the choreography itself. And also because the idea of textures and colors is so important to me in my research, every dancer has different textures and different colors. Yeah, because, you know, for example, if you hear all the 18 etudes, they have all a different color and all a different texture. So it's really like a big buffet of richness that you can experience, I believe, and hope there's something for everyone.
And do you have theatrical inspirations? Do you have either groups or performances you've seen that have really kind of inspired you yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've had the privilege to see a lot during my lifetime, and I've danced in a lot of pieces, which I believe in one form or another have all informed my practice. I feel like my dance language has, you know, I trained a lot in classical dance, but I'm very interested in movement qualities as well. And yeah, there's very, very much that inspired me. It's quite hard for me to pick out like one show, because I feel like it's quite a multitude of things.
And is it almost everything that you work on in some way you bring with you to the next project?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's all a big learning, I feel. For example, like now with Ligeti, I've worked very closely to the score. I've been very inspired by this idea of action and consequence, which comes from his music, but I also believe it comes from me. And now currently I'm working on another project in the early stages of research, where I combine a big classic of classical music, and I combine it with new composition. And I'm very much part of even the music making and the thoughts about this. And it's actually inspired by plants and how they sound. So I continue on this idea of interconnectivity and the work on nature and humans together. For example, this is also maybe something I can briefly talk about, because in the piece, this is something I did very intuitively, but that I now understand. The dancers, they never look at each other, so I almost take the human component out of them.
Right.
And I now see why I did that, because I feel like I often talked about it in the creation process, like, oh, now you're like water, or now you're a river, or now you're I don't know what I said, stones. So for me, like, they were really phenomena of nature, and there's only one moment they look at each other, which is then a very human moment. So for me, almost the dancers became something non-human, but by that I don't mean it in a bad way.
No.
It's just I wanted to open up new ideas of imagination and how to connect to our surrounding.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely fascinating. And how did you come to dance? Is it from an early age? What was your career?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was born in a village in Western Germany, close to Luxembourg, and I just my mom always said I just danced as soon as I could walk at home. So at some point she just asked me, "Do you want to go to the ballet?" Because like that's what we had in our city. So creative dance was not something that was very, you know, very practiced at that time. So I did lots of ballet, and then but I had from a very early age the intuition that I have to go out into the world. I have to like really go to a proper school, because you have to start at a young age. So I begged my parents to leave home And eventually they let me go. So I went to a ballet school and did my A-levels at the same time. And then I went to Lavan in London and did my BA there, which was a huge privilege and opened my eyes completely to the world of dance and to the world of art. Then did my MA at the Place, which is a school in London as well. And yeah, and then I started working as a dancer, because for me it was really important to work as a dancer before I started creating my own choreography, because I felt I wanted to understand, first of all, what is out there, because the world of contemporary dance is hugely eclectic nowadays. There's so many different aesthetics, so there's really no right or wrong, and I really believe anyone can nowadays be a performer or a dancer if they find the right people. And yeah, so I did that a lot. I worked with visual artists, with theater makers, but also like smaller neoclassical companies, and was very interested. It was basically a research of how people direct and how people take the best out of their performers. But I always choreographed by the side or in secret, but I consciously held back and really going out into the world with my choreography from an early age, because I really wanted to research what my language was on about. And so before I did Here Is Move, actually Here Is Move is my first group work. And before that I did a lot of solo work, which also toured to Scotland, have a big passion for touring in Scotland. Yeah, and so the solo work and also the connection with the audience taught me a lot about my own language and my own vocabulary and what I was interested in. And so finally I had the confidence to say, yeah, I think I'm ready to work with other people and to translate my language, yeah, and develop it with other people. And that's when we created Here Is Move.
And yeah, you mentioned a couple of times the kind of research that you do before, and it seems to me that that's that kind of inquisitiveness, as you mentioned with Ligeti, that kind of wanting to learn new things is kind of central to what you do.
Yes, very much so. So for example, like we're planning my next bigger premiere for 2025, but I'm already very deeply in research, because, you know, I feel a big responsibility of what you put out there in the world. You know, it has a consequence what you put out there, and it will be seen by people. I don't want to go as far to say it will influence people, but it will be shared. And I really feel like I have a responsibility also to the taxpayers' money to really think about, like, okay, what do we actually do? Why is it important? How do things connect? How do we give people access to that? How can we communicate in diverse forms what we do? Because I'm also quite interested in, for example, at the moment we are also in St. Andrews or Aberdeen and giving lots of workshops to the community. We are almost all of the time making a publication about our work to just give maybe a more intellectual grounding to our work, because a lot of people don't even know that dance has so many layers. So I'm quite passionate about thinking very deeply about this art form and how to bring it forward.
So it becomes, as a project, each project is as rounded as possible with as many aspects as possible.
Yeah, I believe so. And also, like, my projects are becoming much bigger and much more complex and multi-layered, and I have more collaborators on board. So you have to be ready for this, and also you have to be you have to communicate, like you have to research with your collaborators the depth of it, and share this and create and build something together from the ground. And this takes time if you do it with thought. Yeah, I mean, I can create quickly, like sometimes I have commissions and I do things quickly, but my own practice, which is those pieces, does take time.
Well, Elisabeth, you really made me want to listen to the music of Ligeti, because it's not someone I know. It sounds amazing. And the show as well sounds as though it's going to be fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alice. It was wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for asking me all those great questions.
I'm now joined by performer, artist, and choreographer Louise Ahl to talk about her new solo opera, Skunk Without K, His Son. Hello, Louise.
Hello.
Well, I have to ask you before we get really into it, where does the title come from?
The title is from, basically during the pandemic, I wrote a book of 610 riddles. So that was my pandemic project. And they're kind of, most of them are really short, but there's like a huge amount of riddles basically, and they're like small poems, and one of the riddles ends with the line "skunk without K is sun," and I thought I quite liked it as a title for this work, because we kind of deal with language a lot and meaning making. How do you create meaning through language? And it's also a little bit of a joke in a way, and it kind of speaks of sort of something existing in one form, and then if you remove something from it, in this instance the K, becomes a completely different thing. So I think my work deals a lot with transformation and how things transform into another and why. And so yeah, that's a long answer, but it's kind of that's the gist of it. Yeah.
A book of limericks. You're the first person I've spoken to who that was the lockdown for, not limericks, riddles. Yeah, you're the first person I've spoken to who's done that as their lockdown project. But you've kind of begun to answer my next question, which is, how would you describe the show to our listeners?
It's a 3-act opera. And I would also use the word experimental before opera. Sometimes I don't use that word depending on who I'm speaking to, but I think this is for a kind of arts audience, right? So I can say it's an experimental, non-traditional opera. And it's the text of the work, the libretto, is basically the audio description of the work. So I worked for some years with trying to integrate audio description for blind and visually impaired people into the work that I'm doing in different ways. So previous works, I've kind of worked with the audio description being a voiceover to the work, describing everything. And I've also worked with a live describer as a performer in a work who describes everything as we're doing it. And then I had this idea to use it as song material, and I got into opera. I was working well, I got in the pandemic as well, actually. On a bit of a fluke, I got into this opera training program, and I never really I didn't know much about opera before. I think maybe I'd seen 1 or 2 operas in my life, and was very also like not very interested in opera, and felt a bit like it was an art form that I don't know, it wasn't for me in a way, and it kind of felt elitist and all that. So I but then there was this program which basically was run by a number of European opera institutions, and it was an 18-month kind of residency program for artists that have never worked with opera before, to kind of learn about opera. So my background is more in dance and performance, and so yeah, I applied, and then I got in, and now I'm making an opera for the first time. So it's got a mix of the opera. I'm basically singing the whole audio description of the show, and some of it is recorded as a chorus of voices. So you kind of have the experience is quite surround sound based. So each recorded voice have their own speaker in the space that's kind of placed around, and so you're surrounded by all these voices, which is also my voice. But then I also sing live, sometimes together with the chorus, and sometimes separately from them, me. So and I sing about everything that can be seen really in the space. So the first act is really about describing the space, the performance space itself, and describing the set and colors, and describing me as a performer, what I'm wearing. And then Act 2 sort of, so Act 1 kind of sets the scene in a way for the performance to start. And then Act 2 is, I feel it's kind of about human behavior. And I'm singing, I call it an aria of verbs, because I'm constantly singing a verb that I'm also trying to perform. So it starts with me singing the word crawling, and then I kind of try and embody that word through crawling in different ways. And it continues to lots of other things. So that's like more of a physical performance that I'm also singing at the same time. And so it's a piece that it sort of sings itself into being, and the words manifests its existence, really. And it becomes quite meta in the end, because the third act starts referencing itself and the work so far, and it kind of references back to different memories from the show. And does that make sense?
It sounds incredible. And so when you say references to memories in the show, references to things which happened in the first and second act.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And sometimes it veers into more other subjects that's not necessarily in the space, and it kind of references, because it builds like quite a particular world, I think, in that performance space. But it also start referencing nature and the world that's outside of that, and it also plays a bit with perspective of who is telling this narrative in a way, because sometimes it comes from quite a perspective that's almost telling of a past that's happened, and how the human has behaved in these situations, and almost like a future voice that's telling of the past world where humans existed, but now somehow humans don't exist. And so it's got a kind of that thing going on.
So it's almost different stages. The three acts are different stages to the opera itself. And it's interesting you say that, because I, about maybe 8 years ago, was asked to go and I didn't know anything about opera. It wasn't, like you, I thought it's not for me. There's an elitist aspect to it. That's the way it felt. And then I was asked to go and review an opera that was based on a Scottish short story, a Scottish writer's short story. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And it was really experimental in the staging. And, it was as good a piece of theatre as I'd seen. And now I'm really quite into it. I go to quite a lot and love it. I love all aspects of it and the different ways it's performed as well. And so what did you want to make this more accessible to people? Opera more accessible?
Yeah, well, it's got a few. Access is something that I've thought a lot about with this work. So my main focus has really been on the audio description being accessible, making it really accessible to blind and visually impaired audiences, and also to create the audio description in a way that it's quite fun and playful and poetic, and really like elevating it through this operatic form. Because usually if you use the audio description and you come to the theater, you put headphones on, and it's quite fast delivered description, actually. So it can be quite almost like sports commentary.
Right.
And so I really wanted to slow everything down through this operatic form and create it so that it's it is the work itself. And yeah, and I think it works really well. But then there's other layers of access. For instance, I was thinking a lot about narrative and storytelling, because that's such a strong component in operas, and my work is really not like that at all. It's very abstract, and I don't necessarily tell a story that's linear, and it doesn't have specific characters and such. So I was thinking about how you can tell a story in alternative ways, and that's also how I started researching scent and how scent can be used in performance as well. So with the work, I'm working together with a scent designer, Clara Veal, who's based in Glasgow, and she's incredible. And she's created these 3 scents, so each act has its own scent, and it really works with what you're seeing and hearing, and the scent is sort of I don't know the right word for it, but it's kind of helps to guide you through that, I think. And I think because the piece is very evocative in different ways, mostly through the poetic language, I think scent does a similar thing. And I think it also it creates a certain narrative to have that quality in the air also as an atmosphere. And I think that's really interesting, how you can access performance through different senses, really.
Yeah. Because it sounds like an incredible sensory experience. So because I guess scent, like other senses, will bring for each individual audience member something different. There might be memory, there might be a relationship, there might be all sorts of things. And then, so you've got sound, and you've got smell. What does it look like on stage? How's it going to look to people? Is it just yourself, or are there other performers?
Yeah, it's a solo piece, so it's just me.
Yeah.
And the set it's tricky talking about the visuals, because there's a lot of magic that happens in the piece. So I'm kind of reluctant to
Don't give anything away. No, absolutely.
Yeah, I know, but there has been some images of the work, so I can talk a bit about it. It's the set has been created by this incredible Norwegian artist, Annette Gilein, and it's made out of these 2 curtains that are huge, and they're hand painted, sort of abstract paintings, and the curtains play quite a big role in the piece. They're being revealed in different ways, and they kind of become animated and perform in a way as well. And I think the lighting does a similar thing, where it feels quite alive in different ways. So I feel the performance space feels very alive. It smells and breathes. The light kind of breathes, and the set moves, and I'm moving, and it's a beautiful space. And I think it's funny, because I started thinking about beauty during making the work, and I've never really thought about beauty as it's almost something that's a bit shunned, I think, in contemporary performance, in that sector, where it almost feels like an old-fashioned traditional concept to focus on. And but I've really been feeling like I want the work to be really beautiful, and so we made quite a lot of effort with the music and the visuals and the sound also to make it beautiful. So I hope it's going to be really visually pleasing and orally pleasing, and it's like a pleasing experience. At the same time as it's quite challenging in some ways. It can be quite slow, and because the description takes so much time sometimes to describe, so there's like a huge section where I just talk about the costume really in great detail, and I think for blind audiences that's great, you know, and to have that focus. But I think for people that are not blind, it can probably feel quite maybe slow, and yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's interesting, and I really like the theater also as a space that has the capacity to slow things down, because I feel everything else in the world is really fast and there's a lot of information. And so as a maker, I'm very like, I'm just gonna turn everything down a bit and just kind of let people sink down a bit. Yeah.
And it's true. I think outside of opera, you would probably rarely get 3 acts these days in theatre. It's quite a rare thing. So to say, how long is it as a whole? How long are you on stage for?
Well, yeah, it's 3 acts, but it's not that long of a piece if you compare with operas. So it's about, I think it's maybe 65 minutes long.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it almost sounds as if the audience are, I suppose, always a part of a performance, but often it's there to kind of sit and be a passive part. But this sounds more interactive if they are doing work with, even if it's just with their senses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It's I think also with the type of narrative that's not necessarily telling people what it is. People have to do a bit of work to figure it out for themselves, which I really like, because I don't really like to tell people what it's about, or because I don't even know fully what it's about. I can talk about the things that's, you know, inspired it, or references or things like that, but I think it's for an audience member like a lot more interesting to go on your own journey, and to also be allowed to do that, because to me I'm always really happy when people tell me afterwards, oh, I thought it was about this or that, and people just create their own stories really, which I hope the work can allow them to go into that imaginary space.
And you mentioned inspirations. What were the inspirations behind it? Was there pieces of theatre or other things that you'd worked on, perhaps?
Well, I think opera. I saw a lot of opera in when I did the opera program, and I mean, nothing that I was like really loved, but I just love the form of it. I just think it's so interesting with this really expressive vocals that are so extreme and dramatic, and I love the drama of it, and I think and the music as well. And it's something about, I'm always really interested in the format of things and how to take that format and almost deconstruct it and then make it into my own. So the piece that we made is very it has the format of an opera. It's got the 3 acts, it's got music, we worked with different structures, like, you know, here's an aria, here's the overture, here's the these things, and they're just I'm not sure. I'm wondering if someone who really loves traditional opera would even call it an opera, because it might be so far removed from what that is. But it has the kind of the type of singing. I started taking singing lessons like in the past 2 years for the first time in my life. So and that was a bit funny, because my singing teacher is an opera singer, and she's like, you want to sing opera and you've never really been singing before? And I'm like, yeah. So yeah, so that's been really fun. But now I can't remember the question.
It was just about the inspirations.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess when I've been watching a lot of opera, I've been thinking about accessibility a lot, and how it feels very not accessible on many different layers, really. Like financially, it's extremely expensive to go and see a piece, and yeah, and the scale of it, which makes it really difficult to I don't know, there's a lot of challenges with it, and a lot of hierarchies, and within the making process, and yeah, and the audio description. I had never really heard of an audio described opera before, which I was like, because it's quite, I think there's a bit of a thing going on in contemporary performance with trying to integrate audio description. But I'd never really heard of that in opera, and it just seems like they don't really, from conversations that I've been having during that time, like people don't really think about access so much. So I thought that's interesting to challenge that in a way, and yeah. Now I've lost my plot again.
Well, I think it is interesting, and I know I worked briefly for Access Services for Television doing subtitles, and they did audio description, and the company did signing as well, and all of those things. And I've got friends who do just that. They work for theatre companies now, and actually one of them did work for Scottish Opera. I'm not sure they still do, but it was almost a subtitled or signed rather than audio described. Now, I'm sure there were audio described performances, but in theatre in general, people are moving. They're not yet there yet, but moving in the right direction to make it more accessible. But what's really interesting for you, that you've incorporated that into the piece itself, that is the, as you say, the libretto is the audio description. Did you write it? Have you written your own libretto?
Yeah, so I've written it together with Joe Hellier, who's another artist that I'm working together with, and then we've also got we've been working with a consultancy company for from the start of making the work, really, where they're blind access consultant, and so we've been giving them pieces of text or maybe some filmed material, and sometimes they've come to the studio and I performed some things, and they've given us a lot of feedback, and that we then go away and rewrite things. And yeah, tomorrow we got our final consultancy session, and then that's it, because on Thursday, Friday, Saturday this week we're recording the final version of the chorus. So from when that's done, then no more changes can be made, basically, in anything like the choreography or the set, the lights or anything, because everything is described. So it's got this knock-on effect, and it's been quite a challenging and extremely time-consuming process to make the work, because you kind of, in order to test material, you have to first make some choreography, then describe it, then that gets composed by the composer into music, and then I have to learn it and sing it, record it, and then we can test it and get feedback on it. So there's been this constant back and forth, and changing things and rewriting, and yeah.
So is it almost like a full circle? You have to create the choreography that then has to be described, but then at the end, the choreography has to fit the description.
Yeah.
It started from where that's amazing.
Yeah, I feel
it has to be quite exact. Sorry, on you go.
Yeah, no, I feel sometimes I've just created a nightmare for myself because it's just usually when I make performances, I would make changes up until the very last minute, like even before the performance or even during the performance. I'm like, skip that, I'm gonna do this thing instead. And but with this you just can't, because it has to completely match the description. And the third act is actually the worst, because or best, depending on how you see it, but it starts referencing back, because it starts referencing back to the work itself. My choreography is also based on, I sort of do a Baroque rendition of the previous act, so like a Baroque dance style, and so that also needs to, if I change anything in the choreography for Act 3, then the choreography of Act 2 also needs to change, and the description of Act 2. So it's like constantly knocks other bits out, and yeah, it's quite complex. But I think when it's finished, I think it's just gonna work so well, and I think it's gonna be really exciting that everything is just so connected, and there's something really satisfying and beautiful about that.
But it does sound as though, as a performer, that your concentration will have to be absolute.
Yes, yeah, I'm kind of that. With performing the piece soon, I'm not worried about the piece at all. I feel like the content and the visuals and the sound and scent, everything is amazing, and I'm really excited, and I have 100% confidence in that. But I'm still kind of learning the piece, and it's a lot to remember, like text and how to sing certain things, and also I'm moving at the same time, and also I need to match together with the description and be in time, and yeah, there's a lot of things to kind of hold as a performer. So it's gonna be the performance challenge of my life, I feel. It's kind of it's coming up.
Well, at least you know you're challenging yourself. It's your own challenge that you're doing it.
Yeah, which sometimes like, why am I doing this? But yeah, no, it'll be good. It'll be good.
And talking of a challenge, I hadn't thought about that until you mentioned it, but you're doing this training that you were doing in opera, which of course includes singing, and you hadn't sung opera before. That's quite a challenge in itself, isn't it? A huge challenge to learn to sing in that particular way.
Yeah, it's yeah, it's very difficult. I don't even think I'm a very good singer in general, and opera, I mean, it's no, I'm not going to be down on myself. I think I'm doing as good a job as I can, but I think if an opera singer came, they would probably not be so satisfied with my singing. But it's like, it's my version of opera also.
Absolutely.
I think that's interesting, and it's kind of, if I think about singers that I like, I'm rarely interested in singers that have a very you know, perfect kind of voice that's like very I don't know, what's the word, virtuistic?
Yeah, virtuoso.
Virtuoso, yeah. I'm more interested in voices that are going into weird places, and that's what I'm doing. So
but I think it goes to this idea again of access. I think some people think, well, to be involved in opera, you've got to be highly trained. You've got to be, been doing it since you were like 2 years old or something. Not quite, that's a bit young, but you know what I mean, from a very young age. And again, so it says, well, look, it can be for everybody, which I think is a great thing to say, because I agree with you. I think that opera is such an interesting form of theatre, and it should be for everybody in that way.
Yeah, I'm hoping that a lot of people will come to the show that have never seen an opera before, will become interested in opera. And I think it's great also that it's an opera piece that's being performed in the context of this festival, Take Me Somewhere, and which is more of a contemporary performance festival. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of audience we get, and yeah, maybe it's like the little first window into opera, and that would be really exciting. Yeah.
And we've spoken about the space without mentioning where people can actually see it. How can people come and see the show?
It's on the 20th and 21st of October at Tramway in Glasgow. And yeah, it's part of Take Me Somewhere festival. So there's loads of work on for, I think, over 3 weeks. And the second show, so the show on the 21st is also BSL interpreted.
Right.
So if you're using BSL, then we'll have an interpreter for that show. So that would be good. And yeah, there's loads of work going on at the same time. And I think on the Saturday, the 21st, is also all the work on that day, I believe, is audio described as well. Right. So there is a push of trying to get more of blind and visually impaired people to come to the festival as well. Yeah, but that's it, really.
That sounds fantastic. And I have to say, Skunk Without K's son also sounds, I mean, I'm so pleased to have talked to you about it, because I'd read the press release and I was thinking, how is this going to work? But you've explained exactly how it'll work, which is fascinating. Louise, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, and all the very best on the show.
Thank you.